If some men particularly knew that they could be multi-orgasmic, for example, it would change their complete view on their body, on how they relate to sex, on what they would do sexually, on they would realize that the end goal is not about just one and done, that there's this whole spectrum of things that opens up to them all of a sudden.
Hello, friend, and welcome to the Sex Upgraded podcast, a podcast for men all about sex, where we'll combine real, authentic, and down-to-earth conversations about sex, life, and relationships with some pretty wild personal stories and practical how-to episodes as well, with guest experts from around the world to help you have the most amazing sex life you can possibly have. My name is Taylor, and I'll be your host on this journey, and it's my goal with each episode to give you practical, actionable things you can start doing today to improve your sex life and your entire life, because a thriving sex life will help you thrive in all areas of your life. So let's begin today's episode by starting with a deep breath in through the nose into the belly together. Exhaling with an audible sigh. And let's get into today's episode. Since you are here listening to this podcast, and if you have ever gotten on the internet, I'm going to guess that you have heard about Tantra and the term Tantra and how it relates to probably sex, possibly how it relates to spiritual growth, spiritual evolution. And it can be a really confusing term because there's a lot of backstory and there's a lot of misinterpretations going on. And I'm really, really excited for today's episode with Hema. Thank you so much for being here. Hema is somebody who's studied both classical Tantra and the worlds of Neo-Tantra and the integration of those two, and who has actually taught workshops on this very thing. Like, what is the difference between these two and how do they cross over? And how can you use both of them for your modern life to have more pleasure, yes, but also a more deeply fulfilling life? And thank you so much, Hema, for being here. I'm really excited to get into this with you.
Thank you, Taylor. I'm super excited to be here. I think you just gave a really good synopsis and summary of what we're going to talk about. So I'm excited to dig into more of the details with you.
Awesome. Well, let's do it. And before we get into it, I think it's really important to understand the context and the perspective that you're coming from. And so I'd love it if you would share a little bit of your background, how you got into the work and what is the work you're doing right now, and how have you studied both of these traditions? And I'll leave it to you.
Okay, thanks. Again, thank you for having me here. So my background is, I am born in the lineage. So my parents are actually from India, from the South Asian continent. And I was brought up with some religious upbringing, but not much, to be honest. Funnily enough, given that most of your listenership is male, I'm actually an engineer. So I studied engineering and I worked in tech for like a long time, 36 years, some like big names in the industry. But, there was always this undercurrent of spirituality that was in my life and just in my psyche. And so now what I am is I actually call myself the holistic mystic. So I'm Hema, holistic mystic, and I'm a psychic and an empath and a medium. So it means that I channel messages from above, but I'm also a spiritual mentor and a counselor. And one of my key gifts, or one of the key things that I do in this world, is I help people identify where they're feeling blocked in their life and what that blockage is due to, and help them move beyond that so they can live a life full of passion and purpose and abundance. And so clients come to me to work on a variety of different things, including spiritual mentoring and counseling.
Nice. Beautiful. So then how does that relate to Tantra? Because I thought Tantra was just having better sex.
Well, that is one of the outcomes of Tantra, is you can have better sex for sure. Yeah. And let's face it, sex sells. So people love talking about that aspect of Tantra. For me, my path was, and then I'll get to the question in a moment. I became a yoga teacher. I mean, I was always interested in spirituality, as I mentioned before, and I was part of various groups, spiritual groups, and I became a yoga teacher. And then Tantra kind of came on my path very serendipitously, and I discovered what I'm going to call Neo-Tantra, and which is the tantra that's related to sex and
Hmm.
sexuality, conscious sexuality. And that became the path for me to go more on a what I'm going to call classical
Hmm.
tantra path. So I did a lot of the spiritual study around classical tantra. And so there's two terms that I've just introduced as neo-tantra and classical
Hmm.
tantra. As I mentioned before, neo is a newer term that's being used. You know, neo is the word new, and it's the tantra that has kind of been adopted in the West, that relates to sex and sexuality and intimacy, conscious
Hmm.
relating. And classical tantra is really the study of classical scripts. That are all written in Sanskrit and that are based on ancient things that are written thousands and thousands of years
Hmm.
ago. So I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably during the
Got
podcast.
it.
But Neo-Tantra was my path to discovering classical Tantra and the writings and the teachings therein. So the two paths are super valuable, and we can talk a little bit about the differences and the similarities between the two.
Yeah, got it. Wow, super interesting. Thanks for that introduction. And so, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that the tradition you grew up in, you didn't say explicitly it was classical tantra, but I'm guessing like you grew up in a classically tantric tradition around your, or at least around you.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
yes, well, so we didn't call it
Hmm.
Tantra, and I'll explain why. It's more Hinduism, but there are two different kind of sects within Hinduism. There's what are called Shaivites and then what are called Vaishnavites. And Shaivites are the ones that actually pray to and believe in Lord Shiva, and Vaishnavites are the ones that pray to and believe in
Hmm.
Lord Vishnu. I'm just going to add this little commentary that all gods lead to the same thing. Hinduism can be very confusing for people who look in on from the
Yeah.
outside, but at Hindus, what we believe is that there are different manifestations of different aspects of God, but everything leads back to the one. And that's very clear in all of the teachings. So sometimes Westerners look at Hinduism and are like, is this idolatry? Like, and Hindus are very clear. No, we're not praying to an idol. We're praying to what the idol
Hmm.
represents. And we all know that it's the one, spirit, whatever you want to
Hmm.
call it, God, the universe. So I was raised in a Shaivite tradition, and that is what tantric tradition is based on: is the teachings of from Lord Shiva or following, aspects of Lord Shiva. So that was my upbringing, and we didn't call it tantra. In fact, tantra is kind of a bad word, dirty word right now in
Hmm.
India. Because, and I'll explain in a moment, because it's kind of an off the beaten path way of spirituality that isn't more mainstream. It's becoming more and more mainstream now, particularly in the Western world. But when I grew up, it wasn't really. That's not what it was called. It was just Hinduism.
Got it. Got it. Interesting. Okay. So Neo Tantra is about sex. I'm going to make a gross generalization here. Classical Tantra is about spiritual evolution.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to separate the two. But I'm also going to say that Neo Tantra is also about spiritual
Hmm.
evolution, and classical Tantra has a little bit of sex in it. So there's this really neat Venn diagram that I created because I'm a bit of a
Hmm.
geek on the differences and the intersections between the two. And Neo Tantra does focus on sex and sexuality. People may have heard about things like ejaculatory control and semen retention and breathing and breath work and chakras and orgasms, endless orgasms, and that is all very true actually in neo tantra. And yeah, exactly, big thumbs up. um, as an aside, I want to say for the men who are listening to the podcast, men, you're able to have multiple orgasms as well, and just like women can. So I want to get into that maybe a little
Hmm.
bit. But Neo Tantra is a path to spiritual enlightenment and liberation. It can be
Hmm.
as well. It's just that the focus of Neo Tantra is mostly on sex. Like if you go to any Neo Tantra workshops, they'll all be about, oh, great sex, enhanced intimacy,
Hmm.
better orgasms. Um, and, the goal actually of classical Tantra is not about sex necessarily. It's about spiritual enlightenment. It's about liberation.
Yeah.
So Neo Tantra, although you can have very liberating experiences with that, its primary focus is on better sex. And classical Tantra, its focus is on liberation and enlightenment, so
Yeah.
that you're not attached to any of these things. So that's the key difference. But there's many different ways to achieve enlightenment, and sex can be one of them.
Yeah. So we'll get into the, I want to get into the topic of enlightenment later on in this episode. Like, what is that? Is it possible, et cetera? What does it look like? And also,
Sure.
you mentioned the non-ejaculatory sex and multiple orgasms. Where is that? Or is that even a part of classical Tantra? Is that something like
Oh,
that
it's
we
not
have
at all.
developed?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It's not. Yeah, it's not at all. I mean, it's something that, so I think I need to do a little bit of history of Tantra to explain why things have evolved that way.
Yeah.
And
Let's do
some
it.
parts, even for me, are still not super clear. Yeah. So classical Tantra doesn't have a lot about sex and sexuality, but Tantra as a whole is a
Mhm.
very complex lineage, a very complex set. And so Tantra is really a set of spiritual practices and disciplines that are meant to show you the path to enlightenment. And so Tantra originally originated in the southern part of India, again, where my family is from. And then it migrated north up into Kashmir, up into the northern area, because there was this like hotbed of scholars and funding, I'm guessing, for people doing this kind of study. And I mean, Kashmir is beautiful, it's transcendent. And then it kind of went to China and Tibet. So there's many different kinds of Tantra. You'll hear
Mhm.
about Taoist Tantra, Buddhist Tantra,
Mhm.
Tibetan Tantra. You'll hear about classical Kashmiri Shaivism, which is what I follow. Then you hear about Neo-Tantra. So there's all these different branches. It becomes confusing. And so the sexuality piece of it, although is not in the Kashmiri Shaivism texts, it is mentioned in some of the Taoist tantric texts and the Buddhist texts. So there are some teachers in Thailand, some very famous ones, who teach about ejaculatory control. It's part of the Taoist system. It's part of the Taoist energy
Mhm.
system of the body, and so they teach that. And so what happens is that Neo Tantra takes a little bit of this and a little bit of that, a little bit of conscious relating, a little bit of authentic relating, a little bit of, this is the Buddhist Taoist Tantra, and sort of mushes it all into something called Tantra or Neo Tantra.
Mhm.
And really, the term we should use is conscious sexuality for it, but it's kind of a mishmash of a bunch of
Yeah.
things. And like I said before, sex is fun, sex sells. So people really kind of get interested in
Totally.
that.
Yeah. Which brings me to a question, and I'm curious to hear your personal opinion on this. Like, we in the Western world, we like to pick different pieces and things from different, traditions or patterns or whatever, like serves us, right? And helps life be better for us. And in this particular context, well, in some contexts, it can be problematic. I'm curious if you think like in this context, that sort of cherry picking is necessarily like harmful or problematic, or like, is it ultimately, do you think, a healthy, useful thing to do in this context? And
Yeah,
that's a big
I
question.
think
I know.
this is a very it's a big question. So I'm
Yeah.
gonna address it in piecemeal, and remind me if I don't address the entire part of the question. So there's some complexities here, right? The
Yeah.
Western world has taken pieces that are very convenient to it around yoga, around tantra, around meditation, and kind of adopted it to what feels good in the Western world. So does the end justify the means? Sometimes, because people are having, awakening experiences and transcendent experiences. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to say that a lot of the pieces of Tantra and yoga today have been appropriated. So, appropriated means taking something from a marginalized culture, adopting it as your own. Typically,
Yeah.
there's a power differential there. So, I'm talking about colonialism. Colonialists took a lot of stuff from India, took it back to their own country, adopted it as theirs, and have either profited from it or it's become part of their culture. So that's a very complex topic, right?
Right.
I mean, even in India, the Prime Minister of India was trying to reclaim yoga as from India because it's just become something so different
Mm-hmm.
from what yoga was intentionally created for thousands of years ago. So it's a complicated question. So the mishmash is all about finding things that have been super convenient for the Western world. And Neo Tantra originates from some Western occultism, psychology, some New Age philosophies, and it's kind of this blend of all of those things, including sexuality.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I think Neo-Tantra is very valuable because it places a spotlight directly on sex and sexuality,
Hmm.
which is a very repressed area in the world today. It's a very repressed part of our society, not only in the US, but around the world. I've taught in different countries, and you'd be surprised, even France, where we think that, French people are all about love and sex. I mean, they're pretty repressed around talking about sexuality. So
Hmm.
I think Neo Tantra places a very necessary and needed focus on the sexuality piece. But the danger there is that you become like over rotated, like focused only on that, and you
Hmm.
lose the bigger scope, which is that really this is about enlightenment. It's really about releasing attachment to all things, including sex.
Mm.
So I'm just going to stop there and see if you have any questions on that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that answer. It's nuanced for sure. And what I'm hearing and what I've observed and my thoughts are that in the realm of neo-tantra, because it's this mishmash and because people are pulling from all these different places, there is no one agreed upon thing that is neo-tantra, right? Like 50 different people could call
Yep.
themselves a tantra teacher, and you probably get 50 different descriptions of what that actually means, right? And I would
Yep.
imagine. And so like, in my own personal work as a sexologist and coach, I've kind of wrestled with and struggled with whether or not I use the term tantra for some of the reasons we talked about. And I've landed on using it in some instances because what I see in at least in Western society is that there is this really big split between sex and spirit, or sex and depth, like deeper sex. And because of pop culture or because of books or because of articles or because of whatever, tantra seems like it has become the word that a lot of people who don't really know what they're searching for, they think of when they think, oh, I want deeper sex, or I want to incorporate spirituality into this somehow. So people are searching for that at this point. And it seems like that wave doesn't seem like that's going to stop anytime soon. Right. So I'm happy to have a conversation like this. So at least if people are looking for tantra, they can say or hear like, oh, it actually is this big system that has, evolved over many, many generations and grown into something much, uh, much different than originally it was meant for. But that doesn't mean what's happening now is not a useful practice, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to summarize it. Yeah. I think what's happening now is quite useful and is adapted to people today. It's interesting what you say about the word tantra and the use of it.
Mm-hmm.
In the things that I teach, I try to differentiate between neo tantra and
Mm-hmm.
classical. And there are festivals that use the word tantra. I used to be part of a festival where we use the word tantra. We've moved away from that now. I actually run a retreat called Conscious Connections, and we took the word tantra out of everything because we felt that it was an appropriated
Mm-hmm.
term. So you have to be careful. I think you have to use discernment and judgment when you're looking it up. Now there's tantric everything. There's like, I just saw a tantric dance, I'm like, I don't know what that has to do with tantra. We're going to get into tantric shopping pretty soon. It's just, the word tantra has become just really
Yeah.
misused, right? So just know that it's much deeper than how it's being used today. So that was a good summary
Yeah.
that you gave.
Thanks. So devil's advocate, or at least bringing in something from the the Christian realm of the universe, devil's advocate. When I'm hearing you say like, yeah, tantric shopping and tantric video game playing, tantric all this stuff, like I
Yeah.
think it would be nice to maybe dive in a little bit more to what are some of the original practices of tantra, because in my understanding, there's a lot in those practices that's very much about how do you show up in each moment, right? How are you interfacing? How am I interfacing with each moment in life? Am I interfacing with presence and connection and heart? Or am I sort of like dissociated and half paying attention to what's going on? And I think, and I believe that a lot of original Tantra is about like being here right now in the embodied way. Would you say that's accurate
Yeah, I would
ish?
say that that's somewhat accurate.
Yeah.
There's a little bit, yeah, definitely a little bit more to it.
Mm-hmm.
So remember, I said earlier that Tantra is a word that's considered kind of like a bad word.
Totally.
And the reason is that because Tantra really is defying kind of all societal norms. In India, Tantra is considered to be the left hand path. So in India, the left-handedness is considered, wrong or not
Hmm.
right. And there's a lot of bad media around tantra from before. There's this like little fight that goes on between tantrikas and Vedantists, right? And I'll explain the difference in a moment. So tantra is kind of considered this left-hand path that a lot of people don't follow. It's considered a little obscure. It's also considered really edgy because there are aspects of tantra where you talk about sexuality. Some tantrikis are doing things like covering their bodies in ashes. You'll see pictures of that. There's an aspect or a line of tantra where people actually eat human flesh. But the reason for that is, and people get really shocked when they
Hmm.
hear that. The reason for that is in tantra, everything is God. So there's this non-dual aspect to tantric teachings that says that God isn't somewhere out there. It's not some guy on a cross, right? It's not someone sitting up in heaven. God is here. I mean, right here
Hmm.
within us. God is in everything that is around us. And so the tantric path really forces us to look at that, right? So the person who's eating human flesh, well, they're just eating or doing something that is from God, right? It's not accepted by society, but they're doing it to push the edges on how much can they really see God in
Hmm.
everything. And so one of the pieces of tantric teaching is not just the awareness piece that you brought in, but it's the non-duality piece.
Mm.
It's, can I see God in everything? Can I love the baby, the innocent baby? And can I love the serial murderer in the same breath, with the same
Yeah.
heart? Right? And in society, we have a lot of judgment. Of course, it's easy to love an innocent baby. That baby has no imprints, is so cute, right? But a serial killer, I'm not sure I could love a serial killer because I don't understand
Hmm.
them because they are considered to be evil. But you know what? They're from God too. So that's really what the tantric principle is all about. It's about deconstructing the ego. It's about ego deconstruction, deconstructing things that you identify with, right?
Yeah.
And coming to a place where your mind, your spirit is truly liberated so that you see yourself as a full expression of God on this planet and that everybody else is too. And so that's really what Tantra is
Mm.
about. And so that's the key practice, right? And tantra, the words, there's some misdefinitions all around there, but tantra really means liberation and
Mm.
expansion. So once you expand your view and realize that I'm God, you're God, then I'm liberated because I don't have to judge anything. I don't have to accept or malign anything. Everything is
Hmm.
one. And so therefore you come to this liberated state where like everything is God. And so you don't judge, you don't ascribe bad or good to anything. That's another piece of the tantric path. I get very careful now about placing judgment on this is good and this is bad, or this is right or this is wrong. There is no right or wrong. If it's all from God, then everything is meant to be and everything is part of God, right? So it's a different way of thinking of
Yeah, it is
things.
a very different way, and it's a very confronting and challenging way to think about things too. Because, well, for a lot of different reasons. Like, why don't I just go out and tantrically kill people? From that
Right,
perspective, or like,
right,
what about the
right,
genocide over here or the flood over here, or all this kind of stuff? It's hard to reconcile with, and
right.
I'm curious about my own upbringing and like being steeped in the Western society and how much programming I have received to label things as good or evil, and to really to only see
Right.
things that way. And like, what are some other possibilities? Yeah, that's I'm curious about that, but
Yeah, I think.
no, go
Yeah, go
for
ahead.
it.
Sorry. I was going to say Judeo-Christianity has really influenced a lot of the world today. Even me growing up. I mean, I grew up in Canada, so I was very influenced by the Bible, biblical
Yeah,
references. The whole idea of hell and brimstone and then heaven is just so
totally.
dualistic, right? And so then it really polarizes everything. You're either good or you're bad. And the reality is that we're a mix of all kinds of things. We're a mix of light and
Mm-hmm.
shadow. You know, you can't have shadow without light, and you can't have light shining on something without a shadow appearing, like just from a physics point of
Mm-hmm.
view. So from a psychological point of view, yeah, we're light and shadow. So to assign, good and evil, it's really about mass manipulation and control. I mean, religion is, what's the quote? Religion is about controlling the masses. Um, that's really what Judeo-Christianity was about. Hinduism is way more, I like to call it open source
Mm.
religion. It's and Tantra. It's like, hey, there's like a million different paths to God. As many people as there are on the planet, there are that many paths to God. So follow your path to
Mm.
God, and that'll be the right path. And so it brings up a lot of interesting questions around, yeah, if someone is a serial killer, well, why are they doing what they're doing? Who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't walked in the shoes of one, right? Who knows? I mean, maybe they were directed by God. I don't know. Maybe they got messages and they feel that what they're doing is right. It's a very challenging way to look at that, right? People will get up in arms about it. They'll be like, "How can you say
Mm-hmm.
that? How can you say that about people in history who have done terrible things to people, or even what's happening now in the Middle East?" Well, I say to them, I don't know what the big picture
Yeah.
is, right? I don't know what the big plan is. And these things might be happening over here, but there might be an end game that I'm not aware of. And so yeah, you have to really deconstruct all your labeling around, am I good? Am I bad? Well, you're a bit of both. And I don't like using good or
Yeah.
bad. You're everything, right? It is our imperfections that make us who we are. It's our perfections that make us who we are. And so we're a conglomerate of both things. And the two things are joined. And so why have this
Yeah.
polarization? So I would say that's the biggest difference between tantric thinking and other
Yeah.
thinking. Yeah, and
Yeah, that's
spirituality.
interesting. And I'd love to get into the Tantra versus the Vedanta. Or did you say Vedanta,
Oh, yeah.
Vedantra? But I wanted to bring something else up first. And that is when I'm hearing you say that a lot of original Tantra was to go into the scenarios where, like, the darkest places, right? And the most disgusting potentially
You
to
could.
find
Yeah.
God, like the one path, right? One potential option. And
Yeah.
so now when I think of Western society, like, well, what are some of the darkest places here? What are some of the most problematic places here?
Mm-hmm.
I think of, like, sex obviously jumps out, like, so we have a very, very
Yep.
unhealthy views on sex here in the Western world. And yet at the same time, we're bombarded every day with sexual advertisements and unlimited access to high speed porn in our pockets, constantly. And so there's all this, like, sexual dysfunction, dysregulation, lack of happiness, lack of connections that's happening, and not that many good examples of positive sexuality. So in my mind, I'm seeing like a jump or a pathway from, if we're going to the darkest places to bring light there to find God in those places, like, it would make sense in many ways, whether we call it Tantra or not in the Western world, to be going into the realm of sex to see if we could find at least health there, and perhaps beyond health, divinity also.
I
What do you?
agree. I think sexuality is our deepest shadow and our brightest light.
This podcast is brought to you by all the men who've gone through my trainings over the years. Thank you. You are the sponsors of this show. It could not happen without you. Two things I want to share with you real quick. Number one is my Orgasmic Mastery course. It's a 10-week journey for men to become the best lovers they can possibly be, to master their sexual energy in the bedroom, to overcome premature ejaculation, overcome erectile dysfunction, experience full body orgasms, full body non-ejaculatory orgasms, and to be the man who blows his lovers' minds. The second course is Semen Retention Mastery. This is an intelligent lifestyle design course where you get to master the art of sexual energy transmutation and really build up your life force and direct it into your business, your creative projects, your mission, whatever it is that you want to really excel at and thrive in your life, so you can live the life you truly want. So if you want to check those out, there are links in the episode description. And with all that being said, thank you again. Let's get back to today's episode.
And I think that a reason why people migrate or feel attracted to Neo-Tantra, as I mentioned before, we're so repressed around sexuality. Women, when we get together, I mean, certainly in my groups now, we're a little bit more, I have more forward thinking friends, but traditionally, I mean, we're not talking about sex in our circles, we're talking about very mundane things. in my judgment. But sex is our strongest drive. It's our primordial force. The Taoist tantras say that, like, it's the force of
Mhm.
creation. And why aren't we talking about this, right? It's the strongest drive that we have. And I read somewhere that actually it's thirst, then it's sex drive, and then it's hunger for us in terms of the power
Mhm.
of what drives
Mhm.
us, right? And yeah, we should be talking about these things. And so I would say that sexuality is where also we can get our deepest, our most power. And I always feel like if some men particularly knew that they could be multi-orgasmic, for
Mhm.
example, it would change their complete view on their body, on how they relate to sex, on what they would do sexually, on they would realize that the end goal is not about just one and done, that there's this whole spectrum of things that opens up to them all of a sudden. And the same for women too, is once a woman feels through tantric practices or neo-tantric practices how much power she has in her
Mhm.
body, how much she can access, then the sky's the limit, and we wouldn't allow what's happening now around not having autonomy around our bodies and so on, because once we tap into that, either on our own or with a partner, then it's sublime. And it's same for both men and women. And I'm using the polarity of men and women. I also want to be very gender inclusive of those folks that don't identify as male or female, who are either non-binary or on the gender expansive
Mhm.
spectrum. They too can experience these types of feelings. So yeah, sex is our darkest shadow because we're not in touch with it. We don't feel the power of it. We feel the repression, the oppression of it. And we're supposed to be sexy, but not too
Mhm.
sexy. We're supposed to like sex, but not too
Yep.
much. We're supposed to, want to have sex, but just enough. And we're supposed to not watch porn, yet there's like thousands and millions of videos out there. It's very
Yeah.
confusing. And if we could just drop the whole sex is bad thing, I think that, again, this is very Judeo Christian original
Mhm.
sin. We need to drop that.
Yeah.
And we are sexual beings. I think we just need to accept that. We are here to procreate. But you know what? We could have some fun while we're
Yeah.
doing that. And that's the piece that's missing, is the fun, the lightheartedness around sex and sexuality. There's just a joy of pure exploration of your body or someone else's body. Like, it's really very fascinating. What works on me may not work on you, but that's fun. Like, okay, let's find out what your knobs and what buttons we need to turn
Totally.
to make you feel a certain way.
And
It's just pure play and
yeah, and
exploration.
perhaps that can be a spiritual experience, spiritual sexuality,
Oh, it definitely is a
And
spiritual experience.
I
Yeah.
think, back to when I was younger, I was really interested in all things spirituality related. Meditation, silent meditation retreats, energetic practices, like all the yoga I could find, all this stuff. And at the same time, I was really interested in sex. But none of these retreats or workshops or books or anything that I was reading or experiencing around the world of the spiritual would even touch sex. It was the no-go zone, we don't talk about that here at the spiritual retreat. We don't talk about that at the meditation thing. You do your yoga, but we don't even talk about your genitals and don't even bring your attention there. We'll just stay far, far away from that, And it created
Yeah.
this split for me for many years growing up until eventually I did find some books that were inspired by, I guess, potentially, yeah, Neo-Tantra. They used the words Tantra and they were like, hey, by the way, you can have a spiritual sexual experience. And I remember reading that in a book one time and being like, no fucking way. You're kidding me. That's not possible.
Mind is blown.
Yeah,
Yeah.
completely. Like that's ridiculous,
Yeah.
Eventually, like since then I have experienced the integration of those two and it's been incredibly beautiful. But yeah, I want to empathize with the desire of anybody who's feeling a split between those two. Like, it's very possible for you to integrate those and merge those and experience some really marvelous, miraculous, and amazing pleasure that also is deeply inspiring and creates more connection in your life in general.
Absolutely. I want to touch on something you said before and bring it in to add to your comment. Is that Tantra is an embodied experience. You had mentioned that before,
Mm.
and the difference between Tantra and Vedas, well, people have heard of the Vedas, and Vedantists are those who follow the Vedas. And the Vedantists are all about, oh, you need to separate from everything that's in this material world, and you need to rise above and meditate the fuck out of things,
Hmm.
and just dissociate. It's essentially a whole practice of dissociation. Whereas Tantra is about, no, we're in a body for a reason. It's about being embodied. The tantric path is meant for you and me. It's called the common householder path. It's meant for
Mm.
you and me, the people who are, we have to pay our bills and raise our kids and have jobs and make money and take care of ourselves. It's meant for us because it's about taking those embodied experiences and seeing the spiritual and the God in all of those experiences. So it's not about all the way up here. It's about being in your body. And so,
Mm.
therefore, if we're having sex in our bodies, it is absolutely a spiritual experience.
Mm.
I'm going to name that some of the most spiritual experiences I've had have been through neo-tantric practices. And I was a meditator for decades. Meditator, yoga teacher, and certainly some of the taking that harnessing sexual energy and moving it up through your body,
Hmm.
even through the dirty chakras, the chakras 1 and 2 that nobody talks about, like you said, taking that energy and
Yeah.
moving it through your body, it can be really quite liberating and expansive and powerful. And I've had very visceral experiences of God energy in those moments. So
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And that's the excuse me, the piece that I want to talk about more and more is this: there is an intersection between spirituality and sexuality.
Mm.
Like, let's not remove those, but also let's not get over rotated on the sex piece, right? The spiritual piece is also super important. And just because you had a great orgasm doesn't mean you stop there. I encourage people to search, okay, now that you know this, what else is there possible for you, right?
Yeah.
You can achieve states of bliss without necessarily engaging in sexual activity.
Yeah.
But
Because potentially,
so like I said, there's many different paths.
yeah, because potentially, if you have that spiritual orgasm and then you think, oh, that's what spirituality is, or that's what feels the best, and then you go to that again and again and again and again, and you sort of like cycle in that can be a
Exactly.
problem too. And I think that is one of the problems of the neo-tantra world, is that I've personally experienced and have witnessed this sort of, yeah, like a hyper focus on sex as the thing that matters, or the thing that is going to catalyze your evolution, perhaps the only thing, but it's like, yeah. And letting go of even a useful conversation about sex before having sex for the sake of getting to those heightened states of consciousness that sex can provide. And so that's a potentially other huge area of like, what is the shadow of all this stuff that we could get into. But I'll pause there and see if any thoughts have come up for you in hearing me share that.
Yeah, I think a lot of your comments are so profound. I just want to compliment you and appreciate you for your comments. The sex is important. Let's not deny that, right? I've said that, but like as I said before, it's not the stopping point. It's not. Let's not get over rotated on that. It becomes
Mm-hmm.
addictive. Let's use that word. And so people are looking for that dopamine hit, right? They're looking for that sexual hit, or they're looking for the hit with the plant ceremony or the and I want to say that you can achieve those states without it having to be sexual, without having to rely on plant medicine, without having to vape. All of those things are inherently accessible to you. And the trick is always walking through this world with awareness
Mm-hmm.
and non-attachment, right? Those two things is that be aware of what it is that's happening for you. Are you getting addicted to something? Are you getting overly attached? And then if you are feeling attached, is then to go to non-attachment. It's like, okay, that was great, but I'm not going to hang on to it super tightly, right? Like I'm going to accept this experience that came to me. I'm going to let it go, and then look to live my life and not get like, oh, I want to have that experience again. I want to have that feeling again. I want to have that dopamine hit again. And we are a dopamine hit society, like, social media. I'm guilty of it just
Totally.
as anybody else. I go to Facebook to get that little hit, right? See how many likes I have, I see who's looking at my post. we have been programmed now, wired for that. And so as a society, I think we need to disconnect from that and
Yeah.
actually connect to each other, because that's where the real beauty is.
So would you say that, because I'm thinking now, you just said, okay, you don't need the plant medicine, you don't need the X, Y, and Z to achieve some of these states. So like, what are some ways that people could move towards this without those things? I'm hearing community or interpersonal connection could be one, but
Community is one.
yeah.
I
What
would
would,
say I would say regular spiritual practice. So there are texts, like, for example, actually next weekend in Portland, I'm teaching a workshop that where we'll be going over all of these practices. And there is a text called the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. I'll call it the VBT for short, because we love acronyms, you know. And
yeah.
in there, it's a really cool treatise. It actually has all these different practices, different breath practices that you can do, different practices around how to move energy in your body, how to become aware of each of the chakras in a way maybe that you haven't before, a way in which to do a meditation. Like one meditation, which is really cool, and it's actually outlined in this text, is you light a candle and you actually stare at the flame of the candle, and you get to a point where you're so focused on the flame and actually what's beyond the flame that your mind goes completely blank.
Hmm.
And when your mind goes completely blank, you're in that state of liberation. You're in that state of expansion. And it's to be able to access those states by doing just very simple things. Another piece of the VBT talks about having bodily sensations. So, how you eat your food with awareness can lead you to a
Mm-hmm.
state of bliss. And so it's about practicing. It's about practicing breath work, meditation, these different, other different practices, which I teach. So that's the way in which you can actually achieve these states of bliss, but it's not overnight,
Yeah, for sure.
right? Like a lot of people are looking for the immediate hit in our society. You want the 1 second, 2 second thing, you want the magic pill. This is magic, but it just takes
Longer
time.
term magic.
It takes practice, it takes discipline. Longer term magic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Magic with commitment.
and magic that will sustain itself for much longer than taking the pill or something like that for that hit.
Right.
So to go into this a little bit more, when I heard you speak of the candle meditation, you said, oh, somebody could be staring at the candle flame and everything could absorb or dissolve away, and then all of a sudden they're experiencing this oneness. But like, how would somebody know if that's what they're feeling? Say somebody's listening to this and they think, oh, I want to try that. I'll meditate and look at a candle. Are we talking about a state of consciousness where there's like this, like an absence, almost like a checking out kind of thing? Or are we talking about like you're so in the moment with the candle that you are just like, that is all that's happening kind of thing? You see like what I'm talking about, the difference there?
It's a bit of both. It's
a bit of both.
What a great question. It's a bit of both. Yeah. So you start off and your mind is chattering, like anyone who starts off with a meditation. Your mind is chattering. It's like a little monkey in there. And then the more you focus, let's say on the candle flame, right? The more you become absorbed in that. And it does feel like everything kind of fades away. And you get into this place where your mind is completely blank, but yet you are very aware of what's happening in your body, what's happening around you. So it's this state of like hyper awareness, but hyper focus and emptiness at the same time. And those are the three things I would use to describe it. And I'm just going to say that when you get to that place, you will know, because you feel this very deep sense of peace and rest and calm, but also love. Some people experience like expansive love. Some people have a lot of power that comes up from within them. So, but I think it's really about the emptying of the mind and just allowing everything to fade away, yet having that awareness as well.
Yeah,
I invite people to try it and let you know how it works.
Yeah, I would be really curious. And there's something that came up for me when you were saying that. I'm remembering, I can actually remember the first time I had an experience where I felt that, like that expansiveness, that connection, that lack of thought, that presence all at once. And actually the first time for me, it was really deeply uncomfortable and unsettling at first. It wasn't full of, it wasn't a pleasant expansion. I didn't have pleasant sensations in my body, at least not first, until I realized what was happening. And I I remember I was at this silent meditation retreat. Back when I used to work landscaping, when I was in my early 20s, I worked landscaping for this retreat center. And they said, hey, Taylor, you can, as part of our payment to you, you can choose a couple of retreats that you would want to come to. And I thought, okay, well, I'll try this silent meditation retreat. Like, sounds pretty innocuous. I'll give it a shot. And I remember the end of the second day of basically like doing different yoga asana poses and meditating all day. We went for a walk out on the retreat grounds, and I felt this, this expansion, this presence, this, like all the things you just described, but I also felt this deep discomfort and this thought, like a thought did come in and it said like, something's wrong. Something's bad. You've never experienced this before. And I realized, oh, that's because never in my life have I actually been fully, deeply present with expansive awareness ever before. And that it was the foreignness that was uncomfortable and scary, not the experience itself. And so when I was able to relax into that, it then did turn into this like deeply blissful experience. I remember thinking like, oh my God, this is what people were talking about in those books. This is what they're talking about in the retreats. Holy shit, this is amazing. And I would have those sort of like, oh my God moments, and then like go back into it and come out and reflect and be like, wow, I can't believe it. And then go back into it. But it was a really interesting first touch of that. And I guess I just wanted to say that in case anybody else out there goes into that experience and feels discomfort or unsettledness while they're going there. Like I experienced that, potentially you might too.
Oh, I think that's a great statement. And I think a good reminder for me too, as a teacher. You asked the question about enlightenment earlier, which I'll get to now, which is this spiritual path, if you really commit to it, any spiritual path really, but Tantra, I would say in particular, if you really commit to it, it's not comfortable. There's going to be some discomfort. And thank you for naming, your experience, that first experience of, oh, I feel super connected and I feel empty. There must be something wrong. It's uncomfortable. It's different, right, from how we've been conditioned to live our lives. So you asked about enlightenment. I'm going to say that, everyone talks about enlightenment in yoga circles. They're like, oh, I want to get to enlightenment or my Kundalini this and my Kundalini that. So therefore I'm enlightened. First of all, a person who's enlightened doesn't go around touting the fact that they're enlightened, because it's a very much an internal thing that happens. It's about what you described and how you view the world as a result. So when a person is enlightened, they look beyond the superficial. They can see through the matrix, if you will, and see what's really there. So an enlightened person can tell when a person is not super connected to their internal God awareness. They can tell, where there's lies and things being hidden. It's really about how an enlightened person perceives the world. And there's a famous quote that says that, before enlightenment, you sweep the porch and wash the dishes. And after enlightenment, you still sweep the porch and wash the dishes. The difference is that your internal experience of it is very, very changed, is very different. Yeah. So, it's hard to describe that enlightened state unless you've experienced it. It's a state of just complete expansion, oneness, no delineation between me and the other. And that can be really unsettling for lots of folks, because we've been taught that, Taylor, you're a separate person and I'm a separate person. Whoever's listening to this podcast, you're a separate person. But I want to break it to you that we actually are all one person. We're all one thing. And it's like we're different fingers, but we're on the same hand. And so, that's kind of one of the biggest illusions that we're born into this lifetime with, is this idea of separateness.
Which has, at least at this point, been confirmed by Western science in a few different modalities, that we're all the same thing. And when I'm hearing you talk about enlightenment right now, and it doesn't work with my original idea of what I used to think enlightenment was. Like when I'm hearing you talk about enlightenment right now, it really sounds like ultimately it's a state of consciousness, right? It's an inner state of experiencing the world, as opposed to a state that somebody will achieve and then like pop out of existence because they've ascended or transcended, something like that, right? if I'm hearing you
Right.
correctly. And I think back to, I've been in a lot of different spiritual circles, a lot of different practice realms. And when I think back to some of the most unhappy people that I've ever been around, it's been those who are seeking enlightenment with an idea that, like, oh, they haven't achieved it yet. Something's wrong, sort of a
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, there's a lot of competition. Yeah, there's a lot of competition. Sorry, I jumped in a little. I was getting
Go
excited.
for
There's a
it.
lot of competition in spiritual circles, which is really like the antithesis of what spiritual practice should be about, right? You're not really competing with anybody, shouldn't be. But there's a lot of competition around, oh, I must achieve enlightenment. How do I get to enlightenment? I follow this Sanskrit scholar who's also a well-known tantra teacher, and a lot of people talk about that. And I, again, it's getting over rotated and fixated on a
Mm.
goal, where the spiritual path is not really goal oriented. It's about experience. It's about awareness orientation. So yeah, when you get enlightened, it's not that you're like, okay, I'm peacing out now. See you later. It's you live in this world. And a person who's enlightened, like if you look at Adyashanti, for example, you can just feel the presence just emanating
Mm.
from him. He doesn't have to say a word, and you just feel it. And there are some gurus that have that ability to just transmit because they are so connected and they just transmit God energy, and so people flock to them as a result and get that dopamine hit
Yeah.
again.
Which brings up an interesting potential diversion or branch down the pathway of, in thinking about humanity and the experience of being human, I'm thinking, okay, yes, there is this spiritual category, right? People can do a number of practices. They can reach this level to where they sort of beam and radiate a certain kind of presence or persona that people are drawn to, right? And it also seems to be the case that some people who have developed that ability have not spent potentially an equal amount of time developing their understandings of communication, you know, or power dynamics, or how to deal with like actual human interaction. And so we haven't yet gone into the shadow areas of this stuff, but one of the areas I've seen, and I'm curious to hear you talk about it a little bit, is I've seen people who've done a lot of quote unquote spiritual practices who have achieved a certain state of consciousness that is different than the everyday state of consciousness that a lot of people are drawn to, but then they are really fucking messy in the human department. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, yeah, what comes up for
Yeah.
you when you hear that?
Yeah, I call those people spiritual psychopaths. They, like you say, they're charismatic. They have done some practice. They have access to some energy, something that maybe we don't, commoners don't have access to, but they haven't really worked on all aspects of
Mm-hmm.
themselves. And so then you see these like psychopathic tendencies come out, right? Where they try to manipulate people in a spiritual way,
Mm-hmm.
if you want to be closer to God, you would do X, Y, and Z with me. And we see this a lot in neo-tantric circles. There have been so many schools of tantra that have had hashtag Me Too
Yeah.
incidences, where people are feeling coerced to have sex or being told that they're not spiritual enough, so therefore they need to do something with the leader. And it's men and women. We've seen both men and women do this. There have been a number of schools that have been accused and shut down, and even today there are some schools that are having real problems, and I follow all of these because I'm in the field. So I would say that yes, those leaders exist, and one must question always when one finds a leader or an organization. Question everything. Don't just accept everything that they're telling you. Part of the tantric path is to question: does this feel right for you? Because intuition, and that's something that's called pratibha in Sanskrit, it is very individual. So what's right for me may not be right for you, but I need to listen to that inner
Yeah.
voice, that inner gut feeling that tells me what's right and what's not right. And so what I find in a lot of these spiritual circles, people are so willing to just give it all up. They want to be kids again. They're looking for the mommy daddy to take care of them, and they just want to put everything on the floor before the guru or the leader and say, here, I'm going to give you, just tell me
Mm.
what to do, because that's so much easier, isn't it, than listening to your
Yeah.
intuition and doing what you is right for you. And so people abscond a lot of responsibility when they go into a guru situation or a community or cult situation. And so I would say question, always question whatever the person says. Does this feel right for you? Does this feel true for you? Does it feel okay that he's asking you to give up all your money to the organization? Like really feel into
Yeah.
it, right? And yeah, exactly. Don't buy into everything lock, stock, and barrel because it may not be right for
Yeah.
you. And I think that that is a real shadow. It's if a person who is in leadership hasn't done their work and hasn't reached that full state of enlightenment, there are going to be manipulation techniques that come up. There are going to be ways in which to control the
Yeah.
masses in ways that are different from Judeo Christianity. You have to be
Yeah. Do
careful
you
for
think
that.
it is possible do you know personally of any teachers who you would say they have reached that state and sustained it and are also teaching sexual material?
Uh, that's a good question. I would say no. I was going to say at first, I mentioned
Yeah.
Adyashanti in terms of like a really spiritually involved
Mhm.
teacher, but yeah, no one's teaching that and
Yeah.
sexuality, right? Again, we're back to let's not talk about the dirty
Totally.
chakras. Because sexuality is complex, it's shadowy, it's a strong force, it's um, yeah, and it's complicated. So there's no one that I could name who has reached that real state of
Hmm.
enlightenment that is also teaching the sexuality piece. I don't have a
Yeah.
name for that. I'd like to think I'm one of those people that can do that, but in terms of like a big name, I can't think of
Yeah.
anybody.
And
Yeah.
I would imagine, at least, I feel like I've touched states. Well, I've certainly touched states of consciousness that feel like that, which have been amazing. And I'm very much human with my own bags of shit too. And I try to speak to those in my courses and when I'm coaching and working with people as well, because I don't want people to deify me. But yeah, I think it's so easy to want to deify people and think like, oh, they're enlightened, or oh,
It
they've got it
is.
figured out, and I'll just like surrender my whatever to follow them blindly. And yeah, I just want to echo it's it can be a very exciting experience to want to explore sacred sexuality and to want to learn it, to want to go to different workshops and that sort of thing. And also it's like it opens up some serious doors that I think people need to be intentional with, careful with sometimes, but definitely intentional with, because I've seen a lot of people get hurt in these realms also. Um, and to to pivot here a little bit I know we're coming to the close of our conversation, at least the close of an hour timeline. I wanted to ask you if there are if there's something that comes to mind for you, say that there's somebody listening, anybody, any gender to this podcast, and they think, I really would like to be able to have more spiritual sexual experiences in my life. Like, what would you say would be a good starting point? Like something that they could try today, possibly, or tomorrow. Does anything come to mind for that?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, to be completely self-serving, reach out to me, right? And which I'll give my contact info at the end
Yeah.
to steer you on the right path.
Mhm.
There are lots of good books out there. Um, I would say, start with some stuff from Mantak Chia, who is a Taoist, Tibetan Tantra person.
Mhm.
I mean, he's the one that became the most famous for ejaculatory control and has a lot of stuff that's written specifically for
Mhm.
men. So I would say look at that. I think Multi-Orgasmic Male, I think or Multi-Orgasmic Man is one of his books that was written. I'm hesitant to suggest anything because I feel that a lot of the books or any of the resources that are out there are kind of missing the
Yeah.
mark right now.
Well, then
Yeah, I would say,
may I ask you
yeah,
this
go
then?
ahead.
Instead of a book or a course or anything like that, like, is there a practice, like something that somebody could do in their body to
Yeah.
link these two things together that you would recommend?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I would say that practicing breath work is really important. Being able to just, be able to breathe fully in your body. And I would say if you have a partner, like so full breathing is important because it relaxes your muscles, stimulates the vagus nerve, which then relaxes the whole body and also gives you more oxygen intake, which is always a good thing from a, biological
Yeah.
perspective. But if you really want to explore, conscious sexuality, I would say bringing awareness to your sexual practice. So whether you are self-pleasuring or you're with a partner, take time, like slow everything down. Right. On average, the average American male has intercourse and orgasm in under 3 minutes. And so I would say to you, if that's the case, um, expand the time that you are in these
Yeah. We
sexual
need to fix
states,
that.
right? And do it. Yeah, we need to fix
Yeah.
that. Exactly. And do it slowly, like bring attention to everything that you touch. So if you're touching your partner's body or your body, like really feel, oh, this is what the skin feels like, or this is what, their body feels like, or, and bring awareness to everything that you're
Yeah.
doing. So often with sexuality, we're in our heads, we're performance related. So I would say take goals off the table, take, having to orgasm off the table, take any goals around having to make your partner orgasm off the table, and just be in the pleasure of touching and experiencing their breath and their energy. That's a really good first
Mm.
step, right? To coming more into your body and experiencing more pleasure. The second thing I would say is, read some books about trauma. So here I would actually
Mm.
recommend the book "The Body Keeps the Score" by Bessel van der Kolk, and he talks about how our body can store trauma. So one of the shadows in the sexual work is as you start delving into sexual energy, there's sexual trauma that can
Mm.
come up. And it's not just for women, it's for men too. There's a lot of trauma around there, around genitals and either what we look like or if we've been molested or our boundaries have been violated. So read that book, The Body Keeps the Score. It will talk about what's stored in your body and how to do some trauma
Mm.
release so that when you delve into sexuality, that it doesn't all come up as a
Yeah.
shadow, that you're aware of it and you can release it. So I would say those are the two things: is bring awareness to your practice, right? Through touch and through breath, and learn about what your body stores. And
Mm.
I think that's probably a good first two steps,
Beautiful.
right? And yeah, I can provide you with other resources as
Awesome.
well after the
Yeah.
podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for that. And also, sounds like along with that comes the understanding that growing spiritually with one's sexuality doesn't necessarily mean having all these intensive peak experiences constantly, right? That it's like the full
right.
spectrum range of that. And I really appreciate how you brought the trauma piece into the working with the spiritual sexual piece as well, because a lot of what I've seen out there and a bunch of the first workshops that I went to really didn't talk about that. They just talked about like how can you use breath work to activate yourself and experience these heightened states of consciousness, which do feel really good. And now I am in a somatic experiencing program and studying trauma from a few different lenses and really seeing like, oh wow, this is massive. This is massively important. This actually should be taught in sex ed growing up too, or at least aspects of it. So I can get off that soapbox, but yeah, say thank you so much for referencing that book and for sharing those resources. And thank you so much, Hema, for this conversation. I really appreciate your wisdom and your experience and the way you articulate these different concepts and make them easy to understand. And yeah, I'm just super excited for this interview to go out to the world. And if somebody's listening and they would like to learn more from you or work with you, what would be the best avenues for that? And how can they find you? Knowing that we will also put links in the show notes for people to reach you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, it was exciting for me to be here. I loved all of your questions. I feel like we could have probably gone on for another hour. If people are interested in anything that I shared, I teach both Neo-Tantra and classical. I do one-on-one coaching around intimacy and also spiritual mentoring. So the best way to reach me is you can send me an email. It's hema@hemayoga.com. So that's HEMA at HEMAYOGA.com. I also have a website, so www.hemaholisticmystic.com, so all one word. And there you'll see my offerings and you can book some time with me. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from people, even if it's just to say that they enjoyed the podcast or they have questions. I'm here. This is part of my mission, is to help people understand that they really are God,
Mm.
and that we are not separate from each other. And so anything that I can do to help people on that path, I'm honored to do that. But thank you again, Taylor. This was just so
Yeah,
much fun.
beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And if you're listening, thank you for being here with us. If you liked this episode, if you got something out of it, please let us know and share it with a friend. Help spread the good word. Thank you so much again. And I look forward to seeing you next time.